Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this important discussion of the recent presidential and legislative elections in Ecuador and Peru. I'm Cindy Arnson. I'm director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center, and I'm very pleased to be joining with my dear friend and colleague, Daniel Zovato, the regional director for Latin America and the Caribbean of IDEA Internacional, in sponsoring today's seminar. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has ravaged Latin America and the Caribbean with monstrous numbers of infections and lives lost, the highest per capita death rate in the entire world. This has dramatically worsened high levels of inequality, especially in countries with high levels of informal labor, such as Peru and Ecuador. We have had some results, and somehow my document has just vanished. Let me try this again. Okay, well, I will turn the floor over. I had a brief introduction about Peru and Ecuador, and it seems to have disappeared from my screen. So we will go first to Peru, where the first round of elections led to a surprise outcome. A candidate, Pedro Castillo, who had not even registered in the top 5 or 6 candidates, came in first, followed by Keiko Fujimori, a former lawmaker and the daughter of former President Alberto Fujimori, condemned for his role in massive human rights abuses. In Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso, a businessman, a former banker, won with over 52% of the vote, again defying the predictions of the polls, but he will govern with a divided Congress and has pledged to service Ecuador's debt, to get the economy back on its feet, and how he will do this, not only with a divided Congress, but with the high social expectations of the public, remains to be seen. We have a distinguished group of panelists joining us for this discussion. Cynthia Sanborn will speak first. She is a professor of political and social sciences and the former rector at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, Peru. She will be followed by Carlos Basombrio, who is a distinguished Peruvian journalist and former Minister of Interior and also former director of the Instituto de Defensa Legal, one of Peru's premier human rights organizations. Carlos is also a global fellow of the Latin American program. Following Carlos, we'll turn to 2 Ecuadorian experts. First, Carmen Martinez, who is a professor at the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and a leading expert on indigenous movements in Ecuador. And finally, we are joined by Carolina Corvale from Quito, Ecuador, where she is a research professor at Flaxo. So now I will turn this over to Cynthia Sanborn for her comments, and Daniel Zovato will moderate from there. Thanks especially to Anders Biel, to Oscar Cruz of the Latin American Program staff, and to Catherine Lobel of IDEA Internacional. If you would like to pose a question to one of our panelists, please send a tweet to the Twitter account of the Latin American Program, which is at LATAMPROG, LATAMPROG, and we will go through the questions and direct them as needed. So thank you very much, and Cynthia, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cindy, and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center and IDEA Internacional for inviting me to this panel. It's going to be pretty hard to sum up what we're experiencing in just a few minutes, but I'll give it a try. As most of us know, on April 11th, around 17 million Peruvians participated in the first round of our general elections, and we had a choice of 18 presidential candidates and 20 parties to represent us in Congress. As we know, the first place went to school teacher and rondero Pedro Castillo of the Peru Libre party, with 19% of valid votes and barely 11% of the total voters. Behind him placed veteran politician Keiko Fujimori with 13% of valid votes and just 7% of the total votes. However, blank and null votes came in before that at 17%, meaning that more Peruvians voted blank rather than for second place Keiko Fujimori. This means that just 20% of voters decided who goes into round 2 on June 6th. And now the candidates have to convince the other 80% of us who didn't vote for either of them by offering us something new, or more likely by undermining their opponent. 1 week later, last night, the first post-election polls gave a strong lead to Castillo, with 42% in his favor versus 31% for Keiko Fujimori. But 16% of voters continue to say they will vote blank or null, and 11% say they haven't made up their minds yet. Class differences in this election appear pretty stark. We have upper class voters already saying 52% of them will choose Fujimori, while over 50% of the poor are saying they're going to vote for Castillo, and a large but vulnerable group of middle class voters are divided between the two. The distance between Lima and the rest of the country is also notable, with a plurality of Limeños saying they favor Fujimori, and 51% of the rest of the country saying they favor Castillo, 60% in rural areas. And while Lima has the largest number of voters overall, 34% of the electorate is here, the city also houses large numbers of migrants and lower income citizens whose sympathies are not those of the elite. At this point, 55% of voters say they would never vote for Fujimori. She remains the candidate with the strongest negatives in this race. But there's 7 weeks to go in this campaign, and either one of them could pull it off. So it promises to be a very intense race. So responding to Cindy's comment, is this a surprise outcome? On one level, it's not a surprise. Fragmentation of the vote is not new in Peru. In prior races this century, we've also had large numbers of candidates running, divisions among the so-called left, right, and center groups, a predominance of personality over program, important differences between social classes and between Lima and the rest of the country, with greater radicalism the norm in the South and the Andean highlands. It's also not new to have a dark horse or a lesser known candidate on the national scale who emerges near the end of the race and appeals to voters tired of the front runners. This has been happening since 1989 with Belmont, Fujimori did it in 1990, Toledo, Humala, Veronica Mendoza came close in 2016, and now we have Castillo in 2021. So the surprise here is largely on the part, I think, of Lima-based media and political analysts whose own lenses make it harder to see what the rest of the country is going through. Even though we have more sources online than ever before, plenty of evidence of social tension and conflict over the past year, suggesting fertile ground for more radical alternatives. So what is different in 2021? Clearly, the economic and social context, the impact of COVID and the economic crisis generated by the very prolonged lockdown in Peru, combined with the incapacity of successive administrations to address either one. We've had high levels of political instability, as Peru watchers know, which have exacerbated and made very clear the historically weak state and deficient public services in this country. Peru has had unbelievable numbers of people die, equivalent of 1 in 200 Peruvians, due not just to COVID, but the lack of access to the basic care needed to recover in time. We've had dramatic reduction in GDP, increases in employment and poverty, millions of Peruvians teetering on the line or falling backwards when someone in a household gets sick or loses her job. Combine this with the loss of an entire school year for hundreds of thousands of children and extraordinary stress and domestic violence at home. Social conflict has persisted despite the pandemic, with major strikes by agricultural workers, transportation workers, communities along the southern mining corridor, among others. People are stressed, frustrated, and angry. They want more from their leaders and they want more from the state. They're fed up with politicians who promise and don't deliver and who waste our time in petty squabbles, revenge, and backstabbing. Hence, the size of the disaffected group in this election, the blank, null, and absentee voters, was much larger than in the past, and support for frontrunners was the lowest in the last 40 years. What else is different? Neoliberalism is under more explicit attack, and the Fujimori-sponsored Constitution of 1993 has become a target identified with that. People want something different. They want a state that works for them. And the majority now say they favor a new constitution, even when the reasons are not specified. No más pobreza en un país rico. No more poverty in a rich country. It's the slogan of Pedro Castillo, and it's been very effective. Resource nationalism has become more appealing, especially in those regions where large mines and hydrocarbon projects are based. And Castillo and Peru Libre did very well in most of those regions. They are not anti-mining, on the contrary. They are critical of the green left, especially environmentalist NGOs, and most especially those funded by the United States. But they favor putting exploitation of mineral resources in national hands, giving communities proper property rights over them, and extracting more revenue for the state. And this pitch echoes with those who live in those regions and see all the wealth being created and exported and wanting a bigger share of it. In this race, I'd say democracy is also more severely stressed. Both of the candidates have played by the rules so far, yet the institutions and rights associated with democracy per se are under stronger attack. Authoritarian positions are prominent in both camps. Fujimori embraces the legacy of her father's regime and preaches a hard line on crime. Castillo advocates eliminating the Constitutional Tribunal, enacting popular vigilante justice, and both of them favor expanding the death penalty, challenging the Pact of San Jose. One more thing I think is important here to take into account is the role of education and the role of teachers. As mentioned, having schools closed for a full year has brought unbelievable stress to families with children at home, lack of access to the internet or even the TV and radio options, no teachers to guide them as their parents are busy, limited spaces to study. Schools in Peru have been buffers, places to send kids during the day, as well as a channel for social mobility. So the closure of schools has generated unusually high tensions, I would say. Although Castillo is not necessarily representative of the majority of teachers, the symbolism of El Maestro is important, and most parents want the teachers back in school. Over half of the members of the Congress elected by Peru Libre are public school teachers, and I think this is a significant potential difference in this election. Cindy asked earlier, what could we expect for the relationship between the executive and Congress? And I'd say what stands out is diversity well over experience. We have 130 members of Congress elected in the first round, 51 of them are women. That's a record. More women than ever in Peruvian history will be in Congress. And if we don't have a woman president, we'll at least have a woman vice president. That does not necessarily mean more support for gender equality or progressive family issues, as many of these women were elected from groups with socially conservative banners, explicitly against a feminist agenda, and even more so an LGBTQ one. The majority of members of Congress are newcomers. Only 9 of them have ever served in Congress before. And 101 of 130 will have no prior experience in public office. A third of them are not members of any party, the party that elected them, and 54% just affiliated late last year at the last minute. This is not entirely new. The majority of each Congress in recent times has turned over as voters are dissatisfied and vote them all out. But this is now institutionalized with a ban on re-election, which was promoted under Martin Vizcarra. So do we expect gridlock between the executive and this new Congress? The Congress is likely to be more emboldened with a minority president who will have to reach out and build coalitions issue by issue with a high chance of confrontation. Yet this could also provide opportunities for a well-organized minority to persuade the majority to vote, for example, on more populist and nationalist economic measures or more conservative social ones. What are the implications finally for Peru's battle with COVID or its economic recovery? Well, I'd say, first of all, let's hope that this current administration hurries up and buys more vaccines. Both candidates have criticized the lockdown measures and called for lifting them. Castillo's main proposal calls for more vaccination, Fujimori for wider testing and contact tracing. Castillo wants to reopen the schools, Fujimori wants to reopen the churches, and both of them appeal to small businesses and rural producers who want to get back to work. In international relations and foreign policy issues, they weren't very important in this campaign, but there are significant differences in what each of them would propose to do with an economy highly dependent on international commodity markets, trade, and foreign investment. Peru Libre proposes to reevaluate or rescind Peru's free trade agreements, the Pacific Alliance, APEC, and other trade measures. And Peru Libre is also strongly critical of the Inter-American human rights system, the OAS, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, international arbitration agencies, and most of the heavy artillery is aimed at the United States. It's a strongly anti-imperialist platform. No mention of China, for example. We don't know what would happen there. Fujimori supports the open trade regimes her father helped to promote, Pacific Alliance. She prioritizes free trade in her platform, as well as a harder line on Venezuela, although not necessarily embracing Venezuelan refugees, which has been an issue sensitive to voters in this election. Now, bearing in mind that Ecuador will have a more conservative government, Chile and Brazil may also, it's hard to know how this will play out in diplomatic terms. But at first glance, I would say that neither candidate would bode well for regional collaboration on issues that are so vital to our common American development. And I would just end by saying we have 7 weeks for voters to decide between 2 very problematic alternatives, and either one could be the result. We have a political and economic elite that is reaping what they've sown or not sown in recent years, especially a very triumphant stance on economic growth and insufficient attention to public and social services. And rather from learning from past mistakes, we may be repeating them once again. And on that note, thank you. I look forward to hearing what Carlos has to say.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I enjoy very much your presentation in just less than 11 minutes. You gave a fantastic overview. I'm sure the audience also enjoyed quite a lot. Carlos, please, we would like to hear your view and your
Thank you very much
for
the invitation, Daniel and Cindy. I am very glad to be here. My English is a bit out of use, and this is why I'm going to read my presentation. That is in many ways similar to the one of our common friend Cynthia Sanborn. This election has taken place in the worst political and social scenario Peru has experienced since the 80s and the 90s. Horrible years of hyperinflation and economic collapse that overlap with the shining path terrorism and the inability of the state to confront it with the means democracy provides. These 5 years have been times, these last 5 years have been times of disillusionment and tragedy. We have experienced a deep political crisis generated by the responsible performance of the Fujimori's controlled Congress that sought, from the first minute, to lay down the PPK government. Not only did they achieve this, but also the country entered a situation of instability that ended up also with President Vizcarra dissolving that Congress. But the new elected Congress is even worse. This new Congress impeached President Vizcarra, and his ousting was followed by a brief interregnum with huge mass mobilizations widely repudiated and contested in the streets, with huge demonstrations not seen in the country for decades. Merino lasted 1 week, and the defeated Congress reluctantly appointed Francisco Sagasti as president, who not without difficulties will finish PPK's term in July. 4 presidents and 2 Congresses in 5 years. Add to it the effects of corruption crisis that confirm how rotten the Peruvian political class is. All 6 former presidents are in a way or other under investigation, trial, or already convicted for corruption. Finally, the COVID-19 pandemic ended up destroying our hopes that Peru was making significant headways. We have the earliest and strictest quarantines in Latin America, and they destroyed the economy and brought back hundreds of people, millions of people into poverty, but were unable to contain the virus. Hundreds of thousands, the thousands of people who died on the waiting list to access intensive care units that could save their lives, and the long daily lines outside the providers for getting an oxygen balloon for a relative in pain have been and still are habitual images in the media. All Peruvians, but especially those most in need, have horror stories to tell that affected very close people, and we all have felt the helplessness to see how, because of these deficiencies, their lives could not be saved. The true numbers of death from the virus, and as a direct consequence of its existence, exceed 150,000. The second wave has been much worse than the first one. In March and April, we are suffering an average of more than 1,000 daily deaths. The week before the election day, the one when most Peruvians took their decision of who to vote for, was the worst of the pandemic so far. The following week, this one, has been even more devastating, which means that it will be an important issue to take into account all along the second round. To understand the deep detachment of the vast majority of voters from the election campaign, it is important for you to know that 18 candidates were in competition and that the electoral offer was so mediocre that until the last few days, there were up to 7 candidates that they could be the ones moving on to the next stage. The 7 dwarfs without Snow White. The better word to describe the attitude of the electorate towards the election and its candidates is distance, was distance. Only of the nearly 20 million Peruvians who had the right to vote, the combined votes of the 2 candidates now vying for the presidency did not reach 5 million. As a matter of fact, many more voted blank or intentionally flawed the ballot than for Pedro Castillo. More than 10 million decided not to vote for any of the 18 candidates. Either they didn't go to vote or not filling the ballot. Why did Castillo get the first minority? There are, of course, deeply rooted reasons linked to poverty, especially in rural areas of the Andes and the Amazonia, exacerbated by the economic effects of the pandemic and the disaster that health services turned out to be to contain it. At the same time, it is nothing new that there has been a significant radical left-wing vote in all elections in the 21st century. Actually, the percentage obtained by Castillo is about a third of what Ollanta Humala obtained in his 2 presidential attempts and less than that Veronica Mendoza achieved in 2016. Pedro Castillo had the enormous advantage of climbing very slowly and so going under radar almost to the end of the campaign. Only in the final week, when the polls were not published but spread through the nets, we knew that he was going to move to the second round. Flying low, he did not suffer the usual harsh attacks destined to those in the top places. In the only national debate, he presented himself as an Andean Robin Hood who seeks to take power and money away from the rich to give them to the poor. Very few knew of its links to the Movadef, a facade organism of shining path. Less knew his ultra-radical plan of government, nor that Vladimir Serrón, his mentor and leader of the party for which he is running, sustained the thesis that conquering the government is only a revolutionary act, that the true revolution begins with keeping it at all costs. It cannot be left unmentioned that Serrón, the aforementioned regional governor of Junín, has faced a trial and was sentenced on corruption charges. The dream of any of the candidates in lead, including of course Castillo, was to move on to the second round with Keiko Fujimori. In all runoff simulations, she lost to all the candidates, but they did not include Castillo because he just climbed in the end. The reason Keiko is the candidate that inspires the most rejection of all. To the crimes of his father's dictatorship in the 1990s, we must add his destructive role in the last 5 years that in much explains the political disaster we are living today. Additionally, she's facing corruption charges with plenty of evidence against her. But Keiko Fujimori would also have dreamed of having Castillo as a second round contender. He is a candidate that has a government program that is by far more radical than all of those of the rulers of the ALBA countries or former rulers. On on issues related to property ownership, they propose the statization of the economy, like the one Cuba had once and is trying to leave behind. Peru Libre's, the party of Castillo, attitude to freedom of expression, respect for gender diversity, and rampant xenophobia is, to say the least, unacceptable. Looking at the ultra-ideological sector of his entourage, some Pol Potian reminiscence emerged to me. Not for nothing, in Peru we have had the shining path of racism, the most radical, immune to dialogue, and ideologized armed insurrection of all of those that have taken place on the continent. The second round that will only take place in 8 weeks is an open scenario. The country is now very polarized and neither of them can win. In the first post-election poll, Castillo has 42% and Keiko 31%, but there is a 22 who would not vote for any of them or does not want to disclose their preference. This was registered in the poll to occur in areas where Keiko Fujimori can win more votes than in the ones Castillo has its bastions. Unlike Galán Garcia in 2006, many would vote for her without saying it and not proud to acknowledge it, even to their most intimate friends. In short, if rejection of a potential communist dictatorship prevails, Castillo will lose, as was the case in 2006, when Humala was still very close to Chavismo and was defeated without difficulty by Alan Garcia, who after his catastrophic first government was an even more rejected candidate than is today Keiko Fujimori. Yet, if Castillo managed to convey a more moderate and conciliatory image that he has so far, he could win the election, like Humala did in 2011, when he literally changed his red t-shirt to a white one. The future comes complicated in either scenario. The economy has been weakened by COVID-19. Whoever wins will have, for sure, the distrust of the other half of the country, and the campaign promises have been extremely responsible, and frustration will emerge sooner than later. Neither of them has a majority in Congress, and coincidentally, in both cases, can aspire to a reasonable, faithful support only of a third of the Congress members. Also, it will be very difficult for such extreme positions to build stable alliances with the other third, an archipelago of small benches ranging from the center right to the center left. We will have a complicated future in any of the scenarios, something that paradoxically could be alleviated if both, or at least whoever wins, betrays their past, their entourages and methods of doing politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I really enjoy also your deep analysis that clearly allow us to better understand the complex political and electoral scenario on the way to the second round, and especially the last part of your presentation. Now we are closing Peru and we are moving into Ecuador with two outstanding speakers. I would like first to invite Carolina to give an overview about the electoral and political scenario in Ecuador, and then immediately after that, I would like to invite Carmen. I remind you that those that want to ask questions, please do so to the Latin American program at Latam Proc, as Cynthia announced earlier. This is the way that we are going to get your questions for the Q&A part. Carolina, please.
Well, thank you, Daniel, Cindy, and the Wilson Center team for the invitation. I'm going to try to share my screen in order to put up the presentation. Let's see. Okay, I hope you can all see this. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm gonna refer first to the context in which all this is happening in Ecuador, because I think it's quite important. First, the pandemic, the state of the economy, and the political and social climate that precede and the electoral results, and provide a background for what's going to happen next. So first, I'd like to point out that the COVID-19 pandemic has been pretty hard on Ecuador, as it has also in Peru. We are a small country with a quite small population, but we've had some tough challenges. I wanted to share with you this graph from our World in Data, where you can see the mortality rates for Ecuador above the entire region. So it's more lethal to have COVID in Ecuador than anywhere in any of the neighboring countries. Also, we have the highest mortality rate in the region, and we've had 2.6 on average vaccine administered, doses administered, which is below the 10 world average. So we are really not doing very well with vaccination, which in turn extends this situation of, economic retardation. So when the pandemic hit Ecuador, the economy was in a pretty bad shape. The fall of the international price of oil, which is the main good that Ecuador exports, began in 2015 and reached its low in April 2020. And this also marked the end of the era of the prior administration, the Correa administration, that could profit from high oil prices, and that beginning in 2015 was not a source of income for the country. So that hit the economy pretty hard. Then the public debt is up to 60% of GDP. Most of it is to China. Especially it increased during the Correa administration. Then Ecuador lacked emergency funds. At some point, the country did set aside some funds for cases like the pandemic, but in a type of expansionary policies during the past 10 to 15 years, those funds were spent. So there were no emergency funds. Ecuador in turn has a hard time accessing to international borrowing. So that's very expensive for the country, and is, or was until the beginning of the pandemic, not an option for Ecuador. On top of that, there's in Ecuador, we have a dollarized economy, which the short-term solution of increasing the money supply is not an option. Other economies in the world face the crisis by injecting money from special funds, or others resorted to printing money, which in the long term is detrimental to the economy. But not even that fixed solution was an option for Ecuador. So there wasn't much to do. And the economy shrunk by 12.4% during the second quarter of 2020. In terms of the socioeconomic indicators, we observe, as Cindy said in the beginning, both Peru and Ecuador are countries that where a large portion of the population is devoted to the informal economy. Here is 39%, according to some projections. 1 out of 4 Ecuadorian is poor. So the lockdown measures that the government adopted hit mostly those people who live on a daily wage and have to go out every day and couldn't survive during the lockdown. So one more thing I'd like to say about the economy is that the Moreno administration was able to secure a number of international loans to face the crisis. Among those, the largest of those was an IMF loan. In turn, the IMF loan came with some requirements to put in order the macroeconomic indicators. And in a country like Ecuador, one comes to realize that this, the international lenders have the impact of dividing opinion within the society. Everyone recognizes that there is a need for these funds, but at the same time reject, conditions or reject the fact that they come from international organizations. So this created also a climate for conflict within political actors. What happened in terms of political and social climate? Well, the social polarization that was expressed in the 2019 protests that, flew or happened, similar events happened throughout the country, and I think Carmen will comment more on this, reveal this divide within society. It was, at the beginning, these protests were about fuel subsidies, but they became larger than that when different groups, discontent with the government and the state of the economy and corruption cases and a panoply of different reasons, got together to protest on the streets. And those protests became violent. While the fuel subsidy, which triggered these protests, was overturned by the government, I think that the indigenous movement, which led this protest, was unable to capitalize it politically in the magnitude that they could have.
Hello?
I think. Yes. Hello? Can you hear me?
Adelante, adelante, thank you.
Okay. Sorry. So another of the cleavages I will call within the Ecuadorian society is the divide between correístas and anti-correístas. This has divided the country for over 15 years. The political system has been chronically polarized in Ecuador since 1945. I think it's, I checked, it's the only country that never had the same parties compete in consecutive elections. So this is quite a record to hold, and it continues to be like that. There's a regional divide, small country, but still regions, Amazonia, the highlands, and the coastal region still compete for resources and political power. The current government, a presidential approval is 7%, which is telling, because in this election, there was no official candidate. There was an official candidate, but didn't even have the complete endorsement of the president. So it was a unique election in that sense, that the sitting president didn't have his own candidate to compete in the election. And corruption cases, like in many other Latin American countries, have been silent during the management of the COVID crisis. And even before the Correa administration, the prior administration to Moreno, former officials had to face a number of corruption cases, and this has been a crucial issue during this election. All of these factors that I'm pointing out are crucial for the electoral results that we observe. In the first round, we also had a high number of candidates, 16 candidates actually, but only 4 of them had any meaningful presence in the ballots in the end. First, the Andrés Arauz, which was the Correísta candidate, supported by former President Rafael Correa, obtained 32%. Then Lasso, who ended up being the president, close to 20%, Yacu Pérez, 1939. And then this Javier Hervas, representing a moderate left party, obtained about 16% of the vote. The reason I'm pointing this out is to show you that the polarization of the political system, but this happens in Ecuador. There are usually many more candidates than those that have real chances of winning the elections. But then it's important, and I think perhaps Carmen will comment more on this. It was very contentious because of the result of the runner-up between Guillermo Lasso and Yacu Pérez. They were so close, and there were denunciations of fraud during the election. They were disputing the second place, who would compete against Arauz in the second runoff. So this is important, and it sets a precedent because Guillermo Lasso and Yacu Pérez Perez, who were disputing the second place, publicly agreed, there were cameras, and they agreed that they were going to recount X number of ballots to make sure things were transparent and clean. And then Guillermo Lasso backed off from that agreement, and that set a precedent, I think, for what might happen later on in the country in a time where it's important to have credible agreements. The National Assembly is divided, as Cindy pointed out before. There are 137 seats and 70 are required in order to pass legislation. PSC and Creo, those are the two parties that support the president who won the runoff in the end, who's Guillermo Lasso, but they don't have a majority. Pachacutic and ID form, that's what I painted in the same color, they formed a legislative bloc, but they still don't have the necessary votes. UNES is the Correísta party. Remember, this National Assembly election took place as simultaneously with the first presidential round. So the results reflect what we saw in the previous slide. So here, negotiations are expected to happen. There's a provision in the Ecuadorian constitution, it's Article 148, that states that under certain conditions, the president might dissolve the assembly during his the first 3 years of his term and call for new elections. It's still there. It's never been implemented, but still, it's something that could happen. In the election results reveal a surprise win for Lasso. We were all expecting Arauz to win the election, but he didn't. And it was a comfortable win over the Correísta candidate Arauz. What's surprising about this result is that the percentage of annual votes, those 52 and 47 only revealed valid votes. There were 16% of votes where people wrote on the ballots, and most of them were supporters of Yaku Perez, the candidate who didn't make it to the second round of the presidential vote. And historically, we've had around 10% of new votes. So there was an increase. My take on this is that percentage is the historical percentage that Yaku Perez party got, between 5 and 7% of the vote. That's Pachacutic's support base. And I think those are the voters who follow Yaku Perez directive to vote null. And that's what we're seeing. That's my take on it. But there are a lot of hypotheses out there. So the immediate market reaction was positive in light of this result. Guillermo Lasso is an entrepreneur, comes from the private sector and has been very successful in the management and administration of a local bank. And that's a strength, and also something that from the left he's criticized for, like, this is the banker, he's going to favor special interests. In the end, the public decided to support this, I think, track record of being able to show results. The international markets clearly reacted positively to his election. It is expected that the new president, Guillermo Lasso, will present a tax reform, which is crucial for the IMF loan that Ecuador received. And it's going to be, I think, the first big challenge that he's going to have before the National Assembly in order to gather the votes that he will need to pass this legislation. Another big challenge that he's going to face, vaccination. Apparently, he has stated before the press that he has a plan to do this. So that's going to be a first test. If he's successful with this, the public will be more prone to supporting other of his policies. And the big challenge here, I think, is the distributed conflict that is generated by the costs of the pandemic And to be fair, everything that's been happening before that I described at the beginning, it will be an instrument for the new government, I think, to gather support. What the new president's position will be regarding the cases of corruption. Arauz has stated publicly a number of times that they do not wish to be persecuted politically. There are pending cases, and I think that perhaps one of the reasons that motivated some of the candidates was to avoid, facing these legal challenges that might or might not be well-founded. That's beyond, that's not for me to say, but there are conflicts. So the new government looks after, investigates the previous one, and all the governments have face very strong corruption allegations about the previous government. So now what is he going to do about this? Is he going to use this cheap, the corruption cases as a token to negotiate with UNES? I don't know. There's still a latent risk for social mobilization. I don't think that everything was resolved. I think that the October 2019 process, this mood of still there, and the pandemic has helped or has forced, people to stay home and adopt.
I would like if you can close, because we are exceeding a little bit the time assigned.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's the end of it. So how are the agreements going to take place? Is it possible to negotiate a national agreement? And I think it might be if the government plays the cards right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very in-depth, complete presentation, the context, the results, and the many, many challenges ahead. So it's a full agenda. And now I would like to invite Carmen Martinez. Please, the floor is yours.
Oh, I am muted myself. Yeah, so I'm gonna share also a very simple presentation. If I can start from the beginning. Oh, I don't see the presentation thing. 1 second. Slideshow, okay. So interestingly, we have different things. I was planning, since I am an anthropologist, to focus more on the indigenous role of the indigenous movement in all this. But I also had some kind of extra ideas about Lasso's campaign and Arauz that I want to share, because it's very different from what Carolina was saying. Carolina gave a great context for me to talk about some more concrete things. Well, that's just like a picture from the Electoral Council on the regional divide in Ecuador. Between the blue is the vote for, is where Lasso won, and the orange is where Arauz, the candidate that supported, that Correa supported, won. So there is a very, very clear divide: coast versus highlands and Amazon. And I just wanted to point out like a couple of things here. So I think in the case of the highlands and Amazon, the anti-Correa vote was very strong, because people had been repressed by Correa, either indigenous people or urban middle classes. Some analysts claim that in the coast, there are more supporters of Correa for a couple of reasons. And I think it depends on the smaller regions, but this region towards the north, Esmeraldas, is a region with a strong Afro-Ecuadorian population. Afro-Ecuadorians in Ecuador have been supportive of Correa throughout his rule, in part because Correa implemented anti-discrimination and some kind of anti-discrimination affirmative action measures, and also gave some public positions to Afro-Ecuadorians, sometimes as a kind of attempt to divide the Afro-Ecuadorian from the indigenous movement. These two provinces, Manabí and Los Rios, are strongly strong supporters of Arauz because of the public works that were done there, and also a lot of co-optation of political brokerage there on the part of Correa, and also the recognition of another group that became an ethnic group, the Montubio group, which are the peasants of the coast that were also important kind of constituencies of Correa. However, in Guayas and El Oro is closer, like Arauz won, but it's much closer between Lasso and Arauz because these are strongholds also of the Ecuadorian Social Christian Party and the right. Something interesting is the border with Colombia, how it was won by Arauz, and maybe Cindy knows much more about this, but my interpretation is that it has to do with the Colombian conflict maybe, and with the kind of influence of the Colombian guerrillas there that are more sympathetic to, and that have had some kind of relations, secret or not, with Correa's movement. So that's for that part of the regional divide, and I already spoke about that. And Carolina already spoke about the National Assembly, so I will not focus on that. Well, the only thing I want to say is that even though the National Assembly is very divided, in terms of the indigenous movement, we have a very strong bloc of 27 assembly people from Pachacuti that is going to be important. And Carolina was talking about possible alliances, and I think alliances are very volatile because they can go in different directions. Like, for instance, Creo and PSC, the Social Cristianos and Lasso's party are an alliance already, so they will support the president. Then there is the group by Correa, which is the majority. However, the Izquierda Democrática group, they could have an alliance with the group of the president, maybe, but they could also ally with Correa's group, because in the past, Izquierda Democrática has allied with Correa. So there are different, and I don't think the indigenous group or bloc will ally with any of those, but they will probably pressure the president for concessions, different kinds of concessions, environmental, indigenous rights, and so on. The other thing is, another thing that Carolina mentioned briefly is that even though the assembly is fragmented, we have to understand that the Ecuadorian constitution gives a lot of power to the executive, as she mentioned. So Lasso could be in a stronger position than we think because of all the powers of the executive, and also how the creation of alternative powers like the electoral power and the Council of Popular Participation and Social Control, they took away powers from Congress. Ecuador has 5 powers as Venezuela has, so that might make potentially Lasso a little bit stronger than what it seems looking at this picture. Well, my purpose here is more to talk about the role of the indigenous movement and Yacu Perez in the runoff. Yacu Perez participated in the elections as a candidate for Pachacutic, an intercultural political party in which CONAIE, the main indigenous organization, is a major partner. Perez was the president of Ecuarunari, the branch of the indigenous movement for the highlands. Before that, he was an anti-mining and water conservation activist. In a book, in my upcoming book that is coming up next month, entitled Undoing Multiculturalism, I argue that around 2000 CONAIE shifts, or the indigenous movement shifts, toward a much more open environmentalist agenda and anti-mining, water conservation, and so on, as opposed to the past in which they were more interested in agrarian reform and indigenous rights and so on. And I think Yacu Perez kind of signals this change of the agenda of CONAIE, focusing much more on the environment. He comes from a family of Quichua hacienda workers and was able to educate himself and become a lawyer. Yacu, what else about him? Oh, he was strongly prosecuted by Correa's government. He was charged of terrorism. He was jailed 4 times. He was beaten up many times. I went to the hospital also. And he heads a sector of the indigenous movement that was harshly repressed under Correa. So you can understand here why even though some people outside of Ecuador said, why don't the indigenous movement support Arauz? Why this part of the indigenous movement didn't support Arauz? Some analysts claim that in the runoff, there were not 2 candidates, but 3, interestingly, because Yaku, after the first round, he was very, as Carolina mentioned, he was very close to the results of Lasso. He argued that there was a huge electoral fraud. And he tried to prove it. He exhausted the instances in Ecuador to prove that there was electoral fraud. Actually, they started to claim that there was fraud even before they started to count the votes. And he exhausted the instances in Ecuador, and now he has a suit with the Organization of American States that he has also sent to the United Nations and different places. I have read all the information because I was an observer in the first round of the election, and then they invited me again, but I declined for the second round. But yeah, so he has made some arguments. I don't find them 100% solid. I mean, I'm not gonna say there was or there wasn't a fraud, but I don't think it has been 100% convincing to some people. Well, historically, anyways, he's a very, very strong candidate because historically Pachakutik, or the indigenous associated party, was able to win between 7 and 10% of the national vote. And in this election, he won up to almost 20% of the vote. And he has 27 representatives in the National Assembly. And also he was advocating for the null vote in the runoff, and the null vote got 16% of the vote. Well, I have to say that another thing that maybe won him more vote, apart from the kind of the hard vote of Pachakutik that Carolina was talking about, is that his partner, Manuela Pic, a transnational academic, also an alumna of the Wilson Center, by the way, she also kind of joined Yaku with, even though she's not Ecuadorian, but she kind of contributed with an agenda that is also feminist, pro-abortion, LGBTQ plus rights, and so on. So that kind of attracted some people. One thing that Correa alienated, and I think both Lasso and Yaku were able to gather, is the vote of young people. Many young people in Ecuador, particularly of the lower middle class, felt very alienated under Correa because on the basis of merit, Correa's regime required high grades to be able to enter public universities and to choose your career. So a lot of youth in Ecuador was excluded from education and excluded from having a career in a moment in which the middle class was growing and there was a lot of money. So that created a contradiction. And I think both Lasso and Yaku were able to attract this vote of young people. What else? Okay, there is a regional side also to the divisions in the indigenous movement. So the indigenous movement is fragmented. In my book, I argue that Correa not only repressed the indigenous movement and criminalized indigenous protests, but he also co-opted some middle leaderships, and he also tried to fragment, divide them from Afro-Ecuadorians and divide them between themselves. And there is an alternative leadership of the indigenous movement led by Leonidas Issa from Cotopaxi, and also is prominent there, Jaime Vargas, who is an Achuar from the Southern Amazon. And these two people openly or almost openly supported Arauz in the runoff. So there is like a sector of the indigenous movement that supports Correa and Arauz. I think it's smaller than the sector that supports Yaku. Why? Because you can see there the null vote that Yaku was promoting, and you can see how it is very heavy in the southern highlands, southern central highlands, and that's where Yaku is strong. He's from the province of Azuay, but it's also the section of the country where open pit mining is expanding, and there are the Chinese mining companies are there. So I think that's important. So there is a resistance there. While the kind of the area of the area of Leonidas Issa is more towards the central north in the in Cotopaxi. And I think that has to do with a governor or prefecto that province had, who was a correísta and previously was a member of the Movimiento de Izquierda Revolucionaria, MIR. I think he had some kind of say in co-opting that section of the indigenous movement for Correa. Also, I have to say that Leonidas Issa was very prominent in the 2019 protest that Carolina mentioned, and is a sector of the indigenous movement that is even more open towards violence as a form of protest. Why do I think that Yaku is stronger? Because if you see the pool of the null vote, you see that is much stronger in a large part of the highlands and the Amazon. And also all this area was won by Lasso. Lasso won in all this area. So this part of the indigenous movement were not able to shift the vote towards Arauz. Regarding the null votes, another question that Cindy had about how the null votes affected volatility or lack of credibility of the political system. Well, I already talked about that. Yeah, the only thing I want to say about that is that, yes, I think there is a deep lack of confidence on the political system on part of the Ecuadorian population. When I was there for the first round of the elections, almost no one from any sector thought that the election was going to be clean. And there are many problems there. One is that the electoral tribunal or power used to be elected by Congress with political representation from parties, but Correa changed that to a council that is elected by merit. And I argue that the idea of merit was used by Correa to manipulate who was there and kind of place people who were closer to the regime. So it's not very legitimate in general, that electoral council. And also there were some kind of scandals of corruption with the electoral council that had not been resolved by the time of the election. And the other thing is that many people complain about the campaign, like the image of Correa being used in the political campaign, while Correa was a fugitive of Ecuadorian justice, some promises that were made by some candidates that were fraudulent and so on. So people were not happy in general. My answer to that as an observer, and I put that in my report to the Electoral Council, is that I think there is a need for a conversation in Ecuador of society to kind of think about how to create an electoral power that is more legitimate. So I think a kind of a larger conversation of different sectors of society is needed there. And that will be all on my part for now. Thank you.
Great presentation, Carmen. Thank you so much, especially the perspective from the indigenous population that I think that and the geographic divide that I think that adds a lot of value to the analysis. I would like to invite to do more questions. Remember, you should do it directly to the Twitter of the LATAM PROC, that is @LATAM PROC. Also, we will upload all the presentation in the event site, so you can go there after and can check this great presentation. Let me kick off with two first questions that are coming from the audience. Both are related to Peru. The first one is from Victor Maque, who says, thanks Cindy and Carlos for your well-informed analysis. And the question is, what do you see as key policies expected by Castillo supporters beyond the general hard left and rural population levels? And the second one is from Daniel Almeida from the Investment and Risk Management. He says, hi, great conversation so far. I would like to ask, what is the perspective for the pension fund in Peru, depending on who is the next president? Thanks. Please, Carlos and Cindy, if you want to address these two questions first. And then I would like to invite Cindy to ask the other question.
I start, Cynthia starts.
You want to go ahead?
I don't know, whatever you like.
Okay, this should be a kind of a tyranny. It is too much democracy. So,
Yes.
Cindy, you go ahead.
Okay. Rough. You do clean up, Carlos. Well, what do Castillo's supporters expect? What has he said he wants to do? I mean, I think that there's an immediate expectation that somehow the quarantine is going to be lifted and the lockdown is going to be released as something that a lot of people want and have high hopes for, as well as returning kids to schools. I don't know if that's going to be possible, but it's what a lot of people are expecting and what Castillo is promising. He has said that in his first 6 months, he's going to promote a new constitution to be approved by referendum. He has said that he would put much greater emphasis on the right to education and health, that it should be a right and not a service. It is a right already, but somehow improving or increasing emphasis on education and health. He has also talked about reviewing all these free trade agreements and treaties that are seen as selling out the country and, extracting and exploiting our resources without enough revenues for the state. So those are some of the proposals that he has said that he would do in his first 6 months. Now, he is not going to have a congressional majority. So the things that require Congress are going to require tougher negotiation. And there, I think another question will be, what's the difference between Pedro Castillo and Peru Libre? Porque Peru Libre is a party that was founded by Vladimir Cerrón, and it has quite a few years in existence, but Pedro Castillo is a relative newcomer to the party. He used to be with Toledo's party. He comes from Union movement. So whether or not Castillo will follow the line of that party or whether he will veer in another direction is something we just don't know. On AFPs, I'd like to leave Carlos the pension fund question, but I don't think the pension funds, I don't think we have anybody who defends them anymore. I mean, they defend them in theory, and Keiko Fujimori's father, promoted this reform in security, but I think there's a general sense that they're not working for the vast majority of Peruvians who have no pension, and for those that do, there's a lot of discontent. The current Congress has already moved in a very populist way to, allow people to, remove their funds, take them out. And although the new Congress has got, all new people, I would suspect that the AFPs are going to have to struggle hard to reach out to their members and encourage people to stay in them, because there's a lot of bad blood there, unfortunately, for them. Carlos?
I think for the pension fund is enough. I entirely agree with Cynthia. There is a very severe crisis of credibility of the private system. And in the case of Castillo, he has said he will nationalize immediately the pension system. I would like to distinguish what Castillo voters wanted for him in the coming months and years. I would like to distinguish what the minority, I believe the small minority of his voters that are as radical as him or more radical than him, clusters of ultra-radical groups that exist all around the country, but that they're a small minority of the population and of the voters. I believe that the voters of Castillo, most of them among the poorest of the country, they want what the other poor people voting for all candidates want. They expect a better education, better health services, better salaries, more opportunities of work, a future for their kids. And the problem I think Castillo is generating for the country or for them is that he has said that it's possible to have it almost immediately. That is a matter of who rules the country. If there is a person like him who has empathy with the needs of the population, things will change very quick. I believe that the reality is much, much difficult than his dreams, and they can return to him as nightmares, and also to the country. If in the 6 first months, nothing relevant changed in terms of reality, not laws, not intentions, not discourses, I believe that people will start to think that, well, he's not the one, he is not the person that ran the elections, and as usual, I've been betrayed by the candidate. That in a country that where the other half of the country, because the country is divided now between these two possibilities, will be in panic. So the combination of both situations, I believe, is not the best scenario for us and for nobody. Well, so it's more an opinion. I don't think that they have read the program. I don't think that too many people have read any of the programs of this election, and they react to, they and the followers of Keiko Fujimori also, to white images and what you have in your mind or your expectations for the future. But that's it.
Great. I'd like to turn to a couple of other questions, this from Cindy rather than Cynthia. The names get confused all the time. The first one is from MJT Policy, which has to do with something that Cynthia Sanborn touched on only very briefly in her presentation, which is the role of foreign policy in the elections. And it has to do with the Belt and Road Agreement with China, is strengthening relations with China. Has that been an issue either in Peru or in Ecuador? And has there been any discussion other than Castillo's statements of anti-imperialism about potential relationships with the Biden administration? That's really for all four panelists. So Carmen and Carolina, why don't you lead off? You have to unmute, Carmen.
Sorry, I got a little bit lost. So could you repeat the questions?
Sure. It's basically whether foreign policy was an issue in the campaign, either in Peru or in Ecuador, with specific reference to the role of China, and also with reference to potential relations with the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe Carolina, you might know. The only thing I was thinking in relation to China is that it would be like, since Carolina explained to us that vaccination has been very unsuccessful so far in Ecuador, and it has been hit so hard by the virus, I think the role of China in providing vaccines might be potentially very interesting in Ecuador or any other source of vaccines. But the problem there is that Arauz and the Correa side has maybe a better relationship with China than the Lasso side. So I was thinking about that in terms of, like, because the vaccines are so necessary right now for the population. With also, I was told that recently the new varieties of COVID already showed up in the south of Ecuador, the Brazilian variety. So I was thinking about China in that scenario, but.
In my view, the relationship between the last administration and the Biden administration would be more fluid than the counterfactual government of Arauz. I think that there's more predisposition to sit down and have conversations as well with international organizations and to keep promises and commit to specific policies. I think that will be more fluid. And with China, perhaps acquiring vaccines would be the same for each of the two governments. There's no question that the Arauz model of the economy was closer to the Chinese or to those governments that tend to have more in common with the Chinese and with other Occidental Western governments. And there's no question about that. But I think that overall, foreign relationships will be more fluid with the last administration than they would have been with the Arauz administration.
Cynthia or Carlos?
Yeah, well, I'd be anxious to hear more about Ecuador, because my understanding was that the previous US administration had offered Ecuador a deal to buy out their debt with China if they refused to do business with China. And I'm just wondering if the Biden administration has shown a desire to continue leaning on Ecuador or other countries to back away from China or not. I'd be curious. In our case, you know, Peru has a longstanding important relationship with China. It's our main trading partner, one of our major sources of investment. And there hasn't been any, I mean, China has not been relevant at all. In fact, foreign policy has not really been relevant in this campaign. It's really about addressing the problems at home. The only way in which China came up was with the issue of the vaccines. And we had a kind of scandal in which the Chinese vaccines on one hand were the first and still the most to arrive. And on the other hand, the former president of Vizcarra and other cabinet ministers have now been sanctioned by Congress for having jumped the line and gotten their vaccines before others. And the Chinese government was a bit unhappy with the criticism of China for that, but it's really a domestic issue. And I don't think it's really on the agenda of either of them. Castillo, I have, to the extent that I can read through their programs and proposals, they haven't mentioned China at all. There's a little language about against neo-colonial behavior, but it doesn't say China. And yes, Castillo is adamantly, vehemently anti-US, anti-imperialist, and the US is the target for that rhetoric, as well as the party Peru Libre is an anti-imperialist socialist party, and the US is a target. I would expect Keiko Fujimori to be more sympathetic to both relations with the US and with China. Her father opened up, you know, the very first foreign investment by China in Latin America was in Peru under Fujimori. Fujimori, you know, sold them the very first mining project in Latin America. But I think a question will be important is what is the stance of the US and to a lesser extent China about these new governments, whichever one is elected. You know, the US came out, I think, way too strong for Keiko when she was running against Humala. US embassy officials stepped over the line in expressing their desire for one of the other candidates to win, for Keiko to win. I would assume that the US would not do that this time around. But we'll see, you know, we'll see what the reaction will be. And once either one is elected, how they will relate. But it hasn't been a priority in this campaign for most Peruvians. Carlos?
Very short, because I agree with Cynthia. The only repeated mention to the United States along the campaign was the one of the candidate of the extreme conservative right, who said that he, as he's a businessman, the 28th of July, the day he hoped to be president, he will travel to the United States and will return with 30 million vaccines in his hand. This has been repeated, and I tell you that in order to see the levels of mediocrity, demagoguery, and so on, that was our last campaign. And this includes all the candidates with some differences, of course. No, the external relations has not been an issue at all at the campaign.
Thanks. We'll go on to a question again focused on Peru from Alan Brown, who is the bureau chief at BN Americas based in Chile. He asks whether, how do you think potential investors are viewing Peru after the results of the first round? Are they just in wait and see mode? Carlos, why don't you take that one first, followed by Cynthia?
I don't know. Although I don't know if their mood has changed yesterday with the poll, but yes, they are in a. They were at least in the wait and see mood, and I believe that they think that is must the possibility of Keiko winning the election is most probable, and at the same time, in what I think is a some way simplistic view, that that's enough to solve the problems, the political and social problems we have now. I believe yes, it is a possibility that Keiko wins, but in any case, it will solve automatically the problems that that are important for them: social stability, respect of institutions, and so on. The business local community, both the foreign capitals and national capitals are terrified into the country. Lima middle class also, but that's it. Nothing more to say.
I would add that, and this is partly responding to Alicia del Aguila's question also about whether it's possible to hope for some kind of moderation or agreements. And I think especially major investors that are sunk in Peru over the long term, like the mining sector by nature, are going to be and have to be in a wait and see mode. We remember Ollanta had them very concerned as well. Ollanta was going to charge windfall profit taxes and threaten to change the rules of the game with the extractive sectors, and ended up at the negotiating table. We don't know if Pedro Castillo will be forced to moderate or whether he'll continue with the radical line. But I think especially in the sectors that are sunken and that have long-term projects like mining, we'll be waiting to see. Maybe a key difference now is that the private sector is not going to be able to support the candidates as they have in the past, especially Keiko Fujimori. I mean, some of the charges against her that are still pending are related to under the table and illegal campaign contributions. They supported her the last few times for that, but they can't do that as much this time. There's going to be a lot of watching where the money goes. So I think, we won't see as much kind of advocacy, particularly for her, as they might like. I think no matter who the investors are, I think what's became clear, especially for kind of risk and analysts and others, is that Congress is critical, and the private investors in Peru need to understand Congress better, need to talk to members of Congress, need to get their positions out to Congress. The pension funds have had to do that. They learned the hard way that they have to deal with Congress. And I think other investors as well, but it's too early to know what's going to happen. And we can always hope, as Alicia says in her question, we can always hope that there'll be some kind of arrangement for the good of the country on key issues to keep us on a democratic course, at least.
Thank you very much. I think that we are approaching the end of this outstanding webinar. I will ask each of the 4 speakers to make a final comment, brief, around 2 minutes. I will ask, especially in the case of Ecuador, what happened with Correa? Why we see a Correa so nice, sending a tweet the same evening, congratulating Lasso, now yesterday, saying you can count with the full support of our people in the Congress to move Ecuador forward. I mean, is it something completely new? Is something honest? What is behind this new attitude of Correa? That's number 1 in terms of Ecuador, that I think that is very relevant, and especially regarding the Congress. I think that in both countries, Congress, we are putting a lot of emphasis on the president, who is going to be the new president, what is the new president going to do, but Congress in both countries are going to play a very, very critical role, especially in the case of Peru. The voto preferente, that strongly emphasize the personalities of people arriving to the Congress and no parties, the no re-elections, all these changes that Peru had quite recently in the case of no re-election, how this is going to affect a well-functioning Congress that is very much needed. So please, let me start with you, Carolina.
Thank you, Daniel. You present a very interesting question. Is it honest with the Correa position? I think it actual support remains to be seen, translated into votes in Congress, as you mentioned, which are negotiations in the realm of the legislature are going to be crucial, as you pointed out, and we'll see how that goes. It also remains to be seen if Correa is able to keep controlling his UNES majority or first plurality within Congress. There's a history of breakups within that line of that political organization. I think that most of Correa's reaction emanates from realizing that he's going to be in the opposition for 4 more years. And there are, pending corruption cases, and all of these amounts to forcing people to have a more open, or the key actor to have a more open position. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen, and the next speakers. We need to finish in 5 minutes. There is a lot of pressure on my shoulder, so let's be brief in order to finish one at the given time. Carmen, please.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a very good question, what happened with Correa. I was also very intrigued by how fast Arauz conceded to Lasso. So my kind of guess or wonder is whether there is like a backstage agreement between them, like we will concede, but in exchange, Correa will be able to come back or something. Or I thought about that, because it's not, they are not like that. Normally they don't concede, they fight until the end. So that's very strange. I think also that similar to what was being said about Keiko Fujimori, Arauz could not win because he couldn't overcome the legacy of Correa. And I think that Correístas tried to separate themselves from Lenin Moreno, claiming that Lenin was a neoliberal and had nothing to do with Correa. But I'm not convinced that the population bought that, because I think Correa and Lenin have been perceived as a continuity, as opposed to what Correístas wanted, that was to see Lenin as totally different and right-wing and so on in comparison with Correa. So that will be my answer.
Thank you so much. Cynthia, please.
Okay, I would just like to say, if we could define some common ground, in the case of Peru anyway, that whoever wins, we could possibly move towards something that most people agree on. And I think the first one is, the need to roll out the vaccines and the need to, sort of move that out before we reopen the economy and the schools. The second one is the need to pay much stronger attention to the state, and particularly health and education. There's a demand to reopen schools, but without the kind of reforms we need, it's not going to happen, particularly distance education for those that can't attend as yet. And I think those are things that either party can agree on, and hopefully a majority in Congress. We need to see more pressure from those of us who aren't in either party to push for that. And on the flip side, there's been a lot of concern that because the majority in Congress seems to be socially conservative, particularly on issues of feminism, on gender equality, and on sexual minority rights, etc. And I think there it's civil society that has to reach out and convince more of the population. I don't think Peru is inherently conservative. I don't think any society is inherently conservative. Chile used to be, Ireland used to be. And I think civil society really needs to get the message out about equality and rights for all that clearly haven't resonated with the parties we have currently in Congress. So there's a task as well.
Wonderful. Carlos, your final word, and then Cynthia will do the closing.
Okay. Let me... okay, you can listen to me?
Yes, we can listen you, and you have only 1 minute.
I will talk only about the Congress, your question. Ours is a very small Congress, unicameral, 130 representatives, which is very, very small, one of the smallest in the world in terms of per capita population. The importance of the individuals increase in this kind of environment. even more when political parties are so weak, when most of the members of a given bench will meet each other for the first time when they meet when the Congress started. We have 10 benches, 10 parties that have obtained a seat, and it will probably be 12 or 14 in 2 years, following the experience of all other Congress. Yes, Congress will be very important. It will have power over the executive because not Castillo nor Keiko will have the possibility of having a majority. I believe that it's very hard for both of them to make alliances that give this majority. The most probable scenario was that 1/3 Keiko, 1/3 Castillo, and 1/3 others that maybe they can ally themselves, at least for the Congress management, and be a mid position.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Over to you, Cindy.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you, Cynthia, Carlos, Carmen, Carolina, for joining us. We certainly will be watching what happens in Peru on June 6th, the date of the second round and the subsequent events, and also watching to see how Lasso is able to govern, whether he's able to put the economy back on track, deal with COVID, a challenge for Ecuador as well as for every other country in the region, if not the world. Thank you again for joining us. Just a reminder to the audience that all of the prepared publications, PowerPoints, will be on our event webpage, as will the video of this event. So thank you again for joining us.